Thank you all so much for joining today's webinar call, which is the first Grantmaker for Girls of Color webinar to share the reflections we've heard, learn more about what our colleagues need to move girls and young women of color from invisibility to investment, and to ground us in the start of a conversation about your hopes and expectations for this growing G4GC community. This is Jody Meyer. I'm speaking now from Novo, and I'm joined on the line by my colleague Tanisha McHarris, as well as our G4GC partners from the MIS Foundation, Foundation for a Just Society, and Community for Just Schools Fund. First, we wanted to name that we all still mourn the lives lost and families and communities affected by the tragic events on June 12th. We as a G4GC community stand against homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and all forms of hate that threaten the true liberation and safety for all people. And we honor that all of you as people in this work that are and continue to hold the pain of what happened on that day, as well as what happened on so many days, what's happened on so many days before and after. As we mentioned in our last G4GC newsletter, our partners in this work, Funders for LGBTQ Issues, has coordinated an incredibly helpful resource for how to support those impacted by Orlando. So you can check out their website for more information on what funders can do at lgbtfunders.org. A little over a month ago, we gathered for the first G4GC convening focused on Black girls and young women to discuss how philanthropy can support their needs and leadership. And we're really excited to be back on this call today, where we hope that we can share back with all of you some of what we heard on May 19th and get more specific thoughts from you as a community on how G4GC can support your work as a platform, as well as get some clarity on our guiding principles and values as a collective. And to kick us off with reflections from May 19th, I'll hand it over to our fierce co-chairs of the Planning Committee for the convening, Tanisha McHarris and Nikisha Lewis. We're all incredibly grateful for their co-leadership on the 19th and in today's conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jody, thank you so much for kicking us off. We wanted to first just share a bit about what we hoped were the goals of the 19th, and then move into a conversation about what we heard from all of you in terms of what support could and should look like in order to really move the work forward within our foundations, within our own institutions. And so first I wanted just to share that, again, our goal on the 19th was to bring us all together and to really have a conversation and to talk really about what girls and young women of color need and what was happening across the country. Two, as Jody had mentioned earlier, is to really root ourselves in a conversation around anti-Black racism and anti-Black sexism, because we really believe that that was an incredible, helpful way to start a conversation, to start the first Grantmakers for Girls of Color convening in a conversation about all girls and young women of color and all communities of color across the country. And we also wanted to make sure that all of you felt supported and begin building a community, and we really felt like we accomplished that today. And so we're really hoping that in this conversation we continue talking about what support could and should look like, and think through ways that G4GC, Grantmakers for Girls of Color, can really support all of us and all of you in your work. And I'll pass it off now to my colleague and friend, Nikisha.
Thank you, Tanisha, and thank you all of us for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in this country. I think I just wanted to also express extreme gratitude for all of those who were on the call, who were able to join us in the room on May 19th. If you were there, you know that we had a really rich discussion. And for those of you who are engaging with us for the first time, I hope that this call and this slight report out is supportive of you as you think about how you and your institutions can really move, as Jody said, Black girls and young women, as well as additional girls and young women of color, from invisibility to investment, right? We really want to seek to increase investment for girls and young women of color, centering ourselves in this moment on Black girls and young women. And so one of the things that occurred while we were at the convening was, I think, a really rich discussion led by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and Alvin Starks is a longtime colleague in the field and a leader around racial justice philanthropy. And one of the things that they did was take us through a bit of a polling exercise, if you will, and one of the main things that came up as folks in the room answered the questions that they posed was really that one of the barriers, if you will, to moving investment for girls and young women of color was that we needed support within our institutions, right? So that's what we heard from you all, is that people need support around creating the buy-in institutionally in order to be able to move money from specific portfolios or to create new portfolios that would allow for grant making in the areas or impacting girls and young women of color, in particular Black girls and young women, for this question. And so we wanted this afternoon / this morning to continue that conversation and to gather some more information from you all about exactly where we need to go and how we can build up a community of grantmakers for girls of color in order to get to that place where folks feel fully supported to be able to create the buy-in from their institutions. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Tanisha McHarris, who will walk us through this process of answering these questions and helping, hopefully in this call, being able to garner some answers that allow for us to build ourselves up as a community. Tanisha?
Awesome. Thank you, Nikisha. Now, here's for the fun part. We really, really would love for you all to contribute your ideas and your thoughts in multiple different ways during about 5 questions that we have for all of you. And so I will give you the instructions again, but I'll just share that in each of the questions, you can either submit directly, and you'll see the question soon, your thoughts and ideas, and choose as many as you can. You can also share comments in the chat box on your left corner. So but let me first, before we begin with the questions, give a little bit of context. So during the 19th, we heard many from all of you about what would be helpful, and ultimately we want Grantmakers for Girls of Color to be a community that is supportive and helpful for you doing your work for and with girls and young women of color. And throughout the day, and during the small groups, most importantly, we heard 3 really, really critical takeaways. That first, data and research on what's happening to girls and young women of color across the country, and also philanthropy's response, right? Like, how are funders responding and meeting the needs of what's happening to girls and young women of color across the country? You all shared so much about how data and research would be helpful in making the case, both to your institutions, to colleagues, to the broader network, in order to do the work. 2, you all shared so much about practical tools. We heard a lot about what do I do, or how can I take this back to my staff? How can I take this back to my board? How can I take this back to the community that I'm in? And so we really want to learn more about the practical tools for you all to be able to feel really supported as you're working towards either your institution or another community that is trying to move work for girls and women of color. What is an intersectional lens throughout your institution? And then the third, which is so critically important, is you all said in helping to make the case, I really need to continue building community. That sort of solidarity and camaraderie, but also be able to hear, learn, and to exchange ideas. And so that's a little bit of the context for what we heard, and to really back up for why we're asking some of the specific questions that we're asking. Now, here's for the fun part. So the question is on your screen. I'm going to ask it again. And what you can do is you can pick as many of the multiple choice, and I'll read them out. You can also click other, and if you have other ideas, love ideas. You can, in the bottom left corner of your screen, there's a chat box. Feel free to share your ideas of specifics in that chat box, and we, the presenters, will be able to see it. So the first question, we heard that referencing other funders is helpful. So what are some of the examples of what it means to you all to leverage funders? First is funders speaking to your board. Would that be helpful? Practitioners, organizers, activists in the field visiting your board and staff. Peer board engagement opportunities, having board members of foundations come to your board and be able to share opportunities, share learning, shared experiences. Funder collaboratives. We know there's a lot of funders collaboratives out there. And have you seen that as being a really helpful tool? The funders sharing investment stories, just funders sharing stories about what they're investing in, the success that they're having, so that you can be able to share that. And then others. So we're going to give everyone about 15 to 20 seconds. We already see some answers and responses coming through. Thank you. But we're going to give other folks a few seconds to be able to answer. All right. I love it. I see the answers coming in. We're going to give folks a few more seconds because we know that brilliant thoughts are coming in now. Awesome. Okay, we're going to move to the second question. Nikisha?
Thank you, Tanisha. So it seems like we're at some really, I think, significant answers in that last question. I'm able to go back and see the results. Is that possible? Beautiful.
Yes,
there you go. So I just wanted, before we go into the next question, for everyone to see that it seems like the majority of you want other funders to share with you investments, their investment strategies and their successes and where they're investing. That's how I'm interpreting these answers here, followed very closely by being engaged in funder collaboratives and by having practitioners, activists, organizers, and the like visit with your board and staff. Awesome. Thank you. We are going to move to the next question. It looks like some of you have already started to answer, but it's okay. I think we can still get the information in. So what are some specific research and data priorities that would be helpful to you? The first answer is data on inequity. Second, data specific to regions. Data on specific communities. Data on where investments are now. Research on impacts of philanthropy, and evidence on best practices. Okay, so it looks like because we went back a slide, my apologies, that we're unable to get the voting for this question. If you have an answer, why don't you, just so we can want to be able to get the information in for our purposes, please type your answer in the chat box that's at the bottom left hand of your screen if you're online. Again, if you're online and you're able to use the chat box function, please type your answer into the box and we'll be able to capture your answer there. Thank you.
Great. We're already getting some really great comments. We're hearing research on impact of philanthropy, evidence on best practices, data on where investment goes, data specific to regions, and data on specific communities. Keep the comments and the suggestions coming. It's really great. And most people are saying all of the above. Awesome. All right, we'll give it another second and then move on. Okay, great. All right. I'm going to ask the third question now, and you should be able to see the poll on your screen. This question is specific on tools. So what are some of the very practical tools that would be helpful for all of you as you continue to bring this intersectional lens back to your organization? And so what would be helpful to continue developing a racial and gender justice lens institutionally? And I'll list out some of the suggestions, thoughts, ideas that already came out of the 19th. And then again, please in the comment box, share your ideas. So first, training modules for boards, training modules for staff. So is training really an important tool that would be really, really helpful for your work? Coaching. We know that coaching has been really helpful and insightful for many. And so would coaching be helpful for particular staff members or for all staff members and even including board? Pipeline programs. We heard a lot about needing to support women of color leadership within philanthropy as an opportunity to really continue developing a racial and gender justice lens institutionally. So is a pipeline as a tool and an opportunity helpful? We heard ideas around mapping tools, tracking information, both on where philanthropy is investing, but also tools that really show inequities and what's happening to girls of color across our country to really get some regional or community specific. So at this moment now, if you can begin typing, we already got so many responses now, and also please use the comment box to suggest tools that you either have used before that's been helpful, or even tools that you really dreamed about that could be helpful for your institution. And we'll give everyone a couple of seconds now. All right, we'll give everyone another second, and then we're going to move on. We're already hearing that a tool for self-reflection and self-assessment would be great, helpful. Thank you for that. A list of trainers who are well-versed at working with philanthropic boards. Thank you so much for that. Tools that are written and developed and or created by women of color would be helpful. And we're also seeing that a racial justice lens is important, and even if we primarily fund in the Global South. So no matter where you're funding, the U.S., the Global South, that a racial gender justice lens is really, really important. Thank you for that. Great. All right, we've got some great answers. We're going to move to the next section. Thank you so much for participating, everyone. Keep the answers coming. These are great. All right, really quickly before we move on, I want to share what we hear people saying. So we're seeing that a majority of people are saying we really need, not a majority, but about 70% of you said mapping tools, tracking information would be really helpful. Pipeline programs for women of color, coaching programs, training modules. So basically what we're saying is that a lot of these tools would be helpful, and then we've gotten some really incredible comments, some really rich comments around tools in the comment section. Awesome. This is really amazing, everyone. Thank you. All right, Keisha?
All right, thank you. And so in this next section, we really want to hear from you all about what would make this space better as an actual community, right? So during the convening, a lot of you talked about needing to have the space to really be with each other, right? To be able to build a space to come together, to share strategies, to learn from your other partners in this work, and also to have a safe space to really work out some of the things that may be hindrances to you in advancing this work within your foundation. So this next question is really geared to trying to determine from you what more would be supportive, right? And helping us to foster an actual community around grant makers who are looking to invest in girls and young women of color. And so the first option here, more convening. So is it that we want more convening similar to the convening that we held on the 19th? Is it that you want listservs or online communities, right? So places for us to interact with one another, however that may look. With webinars such as this one, but also webinars that are a lot more information-based, right? Any type of webinar, bringing in guest speakers like our panelists to present in a webinar fashion. Other forms of presentation, let us know. Opportunities to build, communities for women of color funders. So as we were talking about moving investments to women and girls of color, some of you also shared that it would be helpful to have a space for the women of color in the field looking to do this work, to have a safe space to gather and build community. So that's one of the options here. Are there other ways of online engagement and interaction that you want to share with us? Also, other, right? And I know many of you are looking to choose more than one. So choose one of your answers, as the poll allows only to choose one, or choose other, and go ahead and continue to put in the chat function all the other ideas that you have about how we can really foster and build community, and what some of the tools that would be helpful to you in building community if we haven't accounted for them here. So I see some of you are already starting to tell us, right, that it would be all of the above. That you want space to talk with women and girls of color grantee partners, right? Spaces for funders to work with them around planning and brainstorming. I see that there's a note here about having more convenings, but we want to make sure that they aren't so costly, right? So that junior staff and actually more of our staff will be able to attend. It's a beautiful point. Definitely want to look at cost-effective ways to having convenings where folks can be able to come together in a more equitable manner. If there's anything else that folks would like to share, we have a couple more seconds for you to let us know. I think there's an awesome point that's captured here that lets us know that folks want convenings outside of New York. We definitely hear you loud and clear. We understand that New York is not the epicenter of philanthropy, and so we get to travel to other places where funders are. Beautiful. We're going to go at this point, getting our results. And so, looks like I'm not sure if the poll captured all of your answers. I think that we might have gotten a glitch in there, but definitely heard from all of you that not only do you want more convenings, but you would like a diversity of convenings. You like a diversity of attendees, right? So you'd like to be able to have conversations that are cross-sector and cross-issue. You want them to be outside of New York, right, and to travel around the country, also to be cost-effective. And so definitely appreciate all of those ideas and contributions, as well as don't want to make sure that we don't leave out a space to hear from women and girls of color serving organizations, as well as a safe space for practitioners in the field of philanthropy to be able to really talk about what's working and what's not working. Tanisha?
Awesome. Thank you, Nikisha. We got a really great comment in the chat box that basically said more opportunities for us to have honest conversations with each other. And I really, really appreciate just the honesty and some of the thoughts around what could be most helpful. All right. Thank you so much for completing that poll. We want to end this portion really opening up the lines. So at this moment, we're going to open up the lines. And we really want to ask all of you to share your hopes and your expectations for the Grant Makers for Girls of Color community. We know that's a really big question, but we want you to think and share with us what are your expectations for this work together, and what are some of your greatest hopes for what we might be able to do together to make sure that as we think about our next steps in this work, that it is grounded in your hope and in your vision. So we're going to open up the line. You can share it in two ways. You can continue to share in the chat box, in the comments below, and we will report out, Nikisha and I, what we're hearing. You can also voice. We would love to hear your voices. And you can ask to raise your hand on the bottom left corner and basically unmute yourself, and we will be able to hear your voices.
So it looks like the first comment has come in, and someone
The conference
here,
has been unmuted.
is saying that they would like more opportunities for collaborative partnerships. Beautiful. All of your lines are now unmuted, so please raise your hand. Misha, can you hear us? Go ahead.
Yep. I believe I see Kimberly hoping to talk. So, Kimberly, I see your hand raised. I'm not sure if your phone is on, off, mute.
While Kimberly is unmuting, I'm just going to read this comment from Erin. My hope is to have more allies who believe that this is important and more resources to be able to speak about racial justice with colleagues.
Listen. We see Claire Simon saying, I would really like more opportunities for collaborative partnerships, so opportunities for funders to really work together.
And Allie Ray, I would like to have occasional space to talk only with other women about this topic. I appreciate the diversity that men can have to this conversation, so I'm not suggesting that all activities be exclusive. Thank you, Allie.
We heard from Mariana that philanthropic allyship space and understanding of the concept of centering would be really helpful for the G4GC to be grounded in.
And Amelia says that they agree with that some joint problem-solving spaces that are creative and future-focused would be really helpful.
Awesome. We are hearing from some of the hope from Misha, the hope is to actually be able to meet with more women of color, to be able to engage in dialogue and in strategic planning conversations together. We'll give another few seconds or so for folks to be able to share their comments.
All right, and we're also hearing from Christy that their hope is that our efforts will be intentionally inclusive of girls of color who have disabilities. I believe this is an important but overlooked aspect of inequity. Also, the disability rights movement has won important legal protections for students with disabilities. Absolutely. So ensuring that we are fully inclusive of all girls of color, including those with disabilities.
Awesome. We're hearing from Pat that opportunities to align and leverage current efforts, such as the New York City Fund for Girls and Young Women of Color, and other beginning efforts across the country would be really, really helpful for the G4GC community to do. And we're hearing from Adrienne that she would love to get involved with helping to facilitate virtual events to build community. And thank you so much, Adrienne, for sharing an incredible platform for us to check out G4GC. Awesome.
And also, I want to just appreciate this additional point from Patricia Ng that we also want to be inclusive of non-binary youth of color. Beautiful point. So ensuring that we have gender non-conforming youth engaged in this work.
Awesome. Everyone, that is so incredibly helpful. We thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas and hopes. Feel free for the next few seconds or so to continue to leave comments, but there will also be other opportunities via email for you to be able to share hopes, because we know that hope is something that doesn't end. And so thank you so much.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
The conference has been muted.
So this is Allison. Jody, if you're wanting to weigh in, we can't hear you. I hope you all can hear me okay. So I want to just thank Tanisha and Nikisha for that wonderful overview of the May 19th meeting. And thank you all for joining this conversation. This is Allison Brown. I am the Executive Director of the Communities for Just Schools Fund. And had the great opportunity to facilitate a conversation among many of you on the call right now with the preliminary data that we received from the Foundation Center. And what we know, what history tells us, is certainly that we need research to move the pendulum in the right direction, to build on and really leverage the strength and power of Black women and girls and all women and girls of color. Indeed, it is research in Monique Morris's book, Push Out, for example, that has exposed the particulars of Black girls' damaging interactions with the education system. It is the research in the Legal Defense Fund and National Women's Law Center study, Unlocking Opportunity for African American Girls, that has done the same. So we are at an opportune time right now when work for boys and men of color is in high gear and philanthropy is familiarizing itself with the concepts of intersectionality and racial and gender justice. In order to really maximize the opportunities that present themselves, we will need research. So you know that Seema Shah, who at the time was working with the Foundation Center and is now a deputy director at the Cricket Island Foundation, presented at the May 19th gathering about what we know preliminarily about Foundation's support of work for, by, and about women and girls of color. So what you see on this slide is a synopsis of that data. For example, about 7% of U.S. grant making from the institutions surveyed went for work related to women and girls, and that includes white women and girls. Only about 7 to 10% of that number, so 7 to 10% of the 7% that went for women and girls, was designated for women and girls of color. So, the numbers are very, very small that we've been able to, that Foundation Center has been able to count so far. Also, while health was the primary funding issue for women and girls of color, and education was number 5, education was the top funding priority for boys and men of color. So just some very interesting and necessary data points that we received from CIMA in their just preliminary scan of foundation data with respect to philanthropic giving for women and girls of color. And during the discussion period with all of you about the Foundation Center's very preliminary research, we heard from several of you about your priorities for any research that might be conducted about philanthropy support of work for, by, and about girls and women of color. Among other things, we heard first that we must ensure that any data is firmly rooted in a racial and gender justice analysis and competently collected, analyzed, and delivered. We also heard from you that grant dollars must be place-specific, meaning you want to know who is giving where, not just where the grantee organizations and institutions are located, but where is their impact really being felt. On the next slide, you'll see what we still don't know, and we really have an opportunity right now. CIMA shared with us what we do not yet know and what we still need, including, for example, disaggregated data on funding flows to specific ethnic and racial groups. So that was primary, I think, among the things that we still don't know and that we really need to be collecting in order to have a sense of the philanthropic landscape for women and girls of color. We have talked with the Foundation Center about what a research project might entail. And based on those conversations and also based on what we know about the Foundation Center's research and report generation process for the work for Black male achievement, we have a sense of what a research project could be for women and girls of color, and we want to get you all's input. So first, the report would include individual outreach from Foundation Center to funders in the field to review, verify, and clarify funders' data on women and girls of color from 2013 to the present. Second, the report would produce a full research report for broad dissemination that includes overall funding trends of women and girls of color from 2008 to 2014, funding by major subject area, funding trends by geographic region, the top grant makers and the top grant recipients, a snapshot of more recent funding, meaning 2015 to the present, qualitative sidebars highlighting different grant-making strategies and approaches, and more. And finally, the Foundation Center has the capacity to create an interactive map to provide a visual of who is funding what projects and issues and where. That map would help us to identify potential collaborators in work for women and girls of color, gaps in funding, and it also would be searchable by filters such as grants, grant makers, and recipient location. The folks who interact with the map could generate helpful charts and constellations and other visual representations of the data that the Foundation Center would provide. So now we want to hear from you about this potential collaborative opportunity. And here on this slide are the questions that we are posing to you for consideration and discussion. And just to walk through them very briefly, what would be the most helpful to you to generate institutional buy-in, to help you with your strategy development? How can we make this report specific to place and racial gender and have also a racial and gender justice analysis? And what are your concerns about this project, about the idea of the project, about the kind of impacts of such a project? So in just a moment, we will unmute the lines. As that is happening, also please feel free, if you prefer, to type your questions in the chat box so that we can read those for discussion as well. So we'll unmute all of your lines right now.
The conference has been unmuted.
And please raise your virtual hand to weigh in here with any thoughts, questions, or comments, and of course type anything that you want to, any input that you have in the chat box as well in response to these questions or other questions or thoughts that come to your mind. So I see Misha's hand raised. Misha? Misha, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you. Okay, so while Misha is hopefully, Misha? Okay. But there is, let's see, from Kaberi, Foundation Center is
you might
so
try
limited.
hitting, sorry to interrupt, you might try hitting *7 if Allison calls on you to speak to see if that unmutes your line.
Thanks, Keith. Kaberi says the Foundation Center is so limited given the self-reporting and coding. That's very true. It would be helpful to use a different source or take up the heavy lift to gather original data that can or is nuanced and useful. That's excellent feedback. Pat said it would be great to get Foundation Center to do a more specific report, but I wonder whether we should reach out to funders for LGBTQ funders who have been tracking info with greater specificity. Another great point. Kaberi says, I love this idea, but know that the map is only as good as its functionality. Having done multiple maps with different providers, there has been a wide variance in usefulness. Happy to talk more offline if helpful. Misha, should we try again? Let's see if we can hear you. Try pressing *7, Misha, if you want to weigh in here. While we wait for Misha, Susan says, what do we know about the impact of funding on women and girls for non-gender specific programming, such as education funding or youth funding? And that's a great question, Susan, and the data that was provided by the Foundation Center is very preliminary data, and so it includes foundations who have been specifically identified their grant making as grant making for women and girls of color, or whose grants went to organizations identifiable as such. And so if there was a grant, for example, for education or school discipline, for example, we don't know within that kind of broad and general category whether the grant dollars went specifically for women and girls of color or boys and men of color. It's hard to say without that kind of individual outreach that the Foundation Center is proposing to do. Misha, can you, we still can't hear you, Misha. But I will go to Mariana's point here, which says oftentimes funders think they are doing the work, but they are not really doing the work. It will be important to define how explicit they are in their support, and that's another great point. And I think, you know, with a project such as this one, we really, the planning team and the folks who contribute to support such a project could have a say in what questions are being asked of the funders in those one-on-one interviews. So that's a really good point, and should be, we would make sure to include that in those questions. And then finally, Christy says, I agree with the comment about possibly commissioning original research that can be more nuanced. And Misha, thank you for typing in the comment box here. What I believe would be most helpful is really doing a better job of displaying the excellence of Black girls and how hungry they are to live amazing lives. I don't think we tell their stories or allow them platforms to tell their stories enough. I think that is the perfect point at which to segue to Tynesha. That's a marvelous point. And Tynesha, I will turn it to you at this point to share video.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison.
The conference has been muted.
Thank you so much, Allison. Those comments were really, really insightful. As we saw them coming in, we're just really excited that we have so much brilliance on today's call. So we heard from so many brilliant minds and voices on the 19th, and we know that they said so many things that we all went home thinking about how we can show up and do our work even better. And one of the best comments and recommendations came from M. Adams. M. Adams is the executive director at Freedom, Inc., and she provides a great framing for our next and last question today around how funders can really gather and achieve ideological clarity and why it's so important. So for those of you on the line and on the computer, we're about to play it. For those who are just dialing in, we really hope you can hear her voice. You'll be able to visualize it anyway. And we're going to begin the video now.
Lastly, ending with this. So Kwame Nkrumah, who is a Pan-African revolutionary, was one of the key leaders in working to free Ghana. He gave a conference and he talked about unity. And the relevance is, well, I'll get to that in a second. He said, look, we vested interest in the freedom of Africa and the vested interest of the freedom of African people around the world. But we can only get there through unity. And he says, but we can't actually build unity if we don't have ideological clarity on what that means. So unity doesn't just mean you went to the event, I went to the event, and we both were at the event, and therefore we're united, right? He says that actual tactical unity is actually the lowest form, and that doesn't do anything but say that we were all in the same space together. He says ideological unity is what we need to have, right? Funders, just like we strive to in our work, funders need to have ideological clarity and unity in funding. Do you all share principles? Do you all share values, right? Even if your strategy is locally based, like you can only give money in Wisconsin, I wish some of y'all in this room, even if, I'm serious, even if some of you can only give nationally, right? I think that foundations are set up in all kinds of ways. But you have to be united around principles and values. Strategies and tactics will follow. So it does not make sense to base a funding priority around a tactic. It does not make sense to say we saw highway shutdowns, so we're only going to fund highway shutdowns. That is senseless. Because I'm going to tell you something. Highway shutdowns work really well in some places and don't work well in other places, right? You can't just fund based off of tactics, and there's an overemphasis on tactics and strategies where we are weak ideologically, and that is killing us. That is fracturing our movement, and your funds are not being best utilized as a result of that. And so do you have ideological clarity? Are you centering those most impacted? Are you thinking about building power from the bottom up? Are you invested in long-term change?
Hi, everyone. We are back. We apologize for some of the, we hope that some people were able to catch some, not able to hear or see it or actually just love it and want to go back to it again. You can go to the grantmakersforgirlsofcolor.org website. On the website, there is the 2016 convening page, and on the convening page, there is all of the clips. If you go to M. Adams, Executive Director of Freedom, Inc., and the question is how we can achieve ideological clarity, and you'll be able to see the 2.5-minute clip there. And essentially, before I pass it off to Nikisha, is what M was saying is strategies and tactics are often what all of us, those of us in philanthropy, those of us in different institutions go to first to begin designing and figuring out our work together. But unless there's ideological clarity and unity, our resources, our time, and our efforts are not going to be grounded and rooted in the ways that don't disrupt movement work and don't disrupt activism and don't disrupt the actual organizations that are doing the work. And the major point was this, is you cannot have a strategy in collaborative efforts in philanthropy unless we have values and guiding principles. So at this moment, I'll pass it off to Nikisha.
Thank you, Tanisha. And I want to echo the encouragement to go to our website, Grantmakers for Girls of Color, to watch the clip in its totality. I had the pleasure of being the moderator for this panel where M offered this amazing insight, and I believe this charge to our philanthropic community, and that's that we must develop ideological clarity and unity in order to really be able to build out a body of work that is true to the organizers and the activists that we will endeavor to support. That we must find some unanimity of values, of thoughts, and of principles before we can think about the diversity of the actions or the tactics and strategies that we will eventually fund. So definitely wanted to echo that. And so endeavoring, right, to really take on the charge and to answer the call to action that M gave us, what we want to do in these next few minutes is actually develop some sort of framework for our values and our principles that will take us forward into this work. So if you're able, we really want to hear from you. We're going to unmute the line momentarily here, and we're also going to ask you to use the chat box as before to tell us what are some of the values and the principles that you believe ought to be guiding our work in this sector as we endeavor to move money towards women and girls of color, and also for us specifically as a community and Grantmakers for Girls of Color. What are the values and principles that we should be building up as a community? We're going to go ahead and unmute the line.
The conference has been unmuted.
And you also have the opportunity here to use the chat box.
And as you all are thinking about your comments, we really encourage you to text them in if we can't hear your voices. But we heard one person say that M. Adams needs to go, that video needs to go viral. So I just want to share that. So one value that we're hearing people talk about is the value of self-determination, really being those most impacted should be driving and guiding the work. And so we thank folks for sharing that as a value and guiding principle. And Susan, thank you for echoing that. That those who are directly affected by oppressions needs to be at the center of leading the way forward, and that needs to be a guiding principle for our work. Thank you for echoing that. We're hearing from Claire Simon that involvement from girls and young women of color in our decision making. So even as we think about Grantmakers for Girls of Color and the kinds of decisions that we should be making together, making sure that girls and young women of color are at the table and are centered in those conversations.
And I'd just like to echo that one of the things we heard in the room on the 19th was that, similar to this point that Claire just made, is that young women and girls of color and the adults who work with them ought to be co-creators with philanthropic practitioners in developing the strategies. And so not only do they need to be involved in decision-making, but before we get to decisions, when we're actually at tables envisioning what our portfolios are going to look like, that they need to be engaged in the process with us as co-creators.
Awesome. We're also hearing that we want Grantmakers for Girls of Color community to be a place for courage, those courageous conversations, courage in the way that we work together and do this work. So really appreciate folks lifting up courage as a value. Give a few seconds for folks to be able to share a comment on the chat option. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And now we will pass it back to Jody.
Hi. Thank you so much, Nikisha, Allison, and Tanisha, and thanks to everyone on the line for your input, thoughts, and visioning. This has been incredibly useful for us as we continue to shape Grantmakers for Girls of Color as a platform and a community. And we appreciate all of the love, energy you brought to our call today, and especially your patience with all of the tech issues. You can test the platform a million times and still have issues on the day of. So thanks for your patience and for continuing to flow with feedback and input, even with those challenges. As we shared at the beginning of the call, this is a community that is and will continue to be defined by all of you. So as an immediate next step, we'll be sharing the poll results, some of which you saw, some of which you didn't, along with a summary of the incredible feedback that you all provided. So we'll take all of the comments and collate that into themes and share that back with this community. So you can all see the priorities as you just defined in one place. We'll also collate and share the feedback and next steps with the research project that Allison spoke to and share ways to get involved in that directly. And next week we will be launching a funder-only listserv for Grantmakers for Girls of Color. So you'll be receiving an invitation for that in the next few days. We realize that didn't rise to the top as the most critical thing that people want out of G4GC, but do think that it will be a great space to continue these conversations and to pursue next steps that were shaped by today's conversations. So thank you for all of that input. And in the meantime, please continue to find the latest news, research, events, and partnerships on our website, grantmakersforgirlsofcolor.org. And thanks to everyone. Again, we really look forward to being in community with all of you and really working towards moving girls and young women of color from invisibility to investment moving forward. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.